The coastal redwoods of Northern California are more than just trees. They are towers of living time, giants older than the Roman Empire, older than the pyramids, older even than most of the religions humanity follows today. They rise hundreds of feet into the fog-drenched sky, forming a cathedral of wood and silence so overwhelming that even animals move differently inside the forest. People describe the redwood groves as alive in a way normal forests are not, watchful, heavy, observing. But over the last century, something far more disturbing has emerged from these ancient woods. Sightings of silhouettes moving inside the trees. Rangers patrolling at night reported tall shadows sliding between trunks, but not walking on the ground, moving through the trees themselves, as though the wood were water and the shadows were drifting within it. Campers heard faint groans echoing from inside the bark, like something breathing through the rings. Hunters found claw-like patterns carved deep into trunks, patterns too smooth and too high above the ground to be made by any known creature. And in the deepest, oldest groves, people described an unsettling sensation that something enormous was above them, or inside them, just out of sight. Most people dismissed these stories as illusions caused by fog or fear, until the cameras started failing. Over the last 2 decades, every ranger body cam, wildlife camera, drone feed, and phone recording taken within a specific radius of the oldest redwoods suffers the same glitch. The footage warps, bends, flickers, and then collapses into black the moment anything tall and humanoid enters the frame. Not blurry, not corrupted, completely dead. As if something inside the forest can sense technology, watching, and shuts it down. The U.S. Park Service blamed natural electromagnetic interference. But their own internal investigators recorded something far more specific. Every device fails when pointed at trunks older than 2,000 years. Younger redwoods don't trigger the effect. Only the elder trees, as the few rangers in the know call them. 3 of those elder trees have official names removed from public maps. They appear as blank spaces on internal ranger GPS files, just unmarked circles. And within those circles, the reports are the same. Footsteps next to the trunk that leave no prints, deep vibrations in the soil, and shadowy figures drifting behind bark as if swimming in the wood grain. The first major incident occurred in 1998. A ranger named Thomas Reeves was investigating complaints about strange lights spiraling in the fog around Redwood Creek. When he reached the grove known as Cathedral Wood, he saw something impossible. A tall, black silhouette moving inside the trunk of a redwood. It had a shape, long limbs, broad shoulders, but no texture, no detail, just a darkness darker than the forest around it. It moved upward, passing through the layers of bark like smoke rising through air. Reeves froze. The shadow paused, turning its featureless head toward him, and in that moment, his body cam shut off. The forest became silent, unnaturally silent, as if the insects and wind had stopped together. Then the shadow disappeared into the tree's hollow and vanished. Reeves quit 2 weeks later, but before leaving, he left a handwritten note in his logbook. The trees are not empty. After that night, the Park Service restricted access to Cathedral Wood, officially due to unstable soil. But the rangers knew better. They had all seen things, shapes in the fog, figures drifting between trunks, sounds of whispering deep inside hollow redwoods. And the older the tree, the stronger the presence became. Some rangers began to believe the redwoods were not just ancient organisms, but gateways. Not portals in a fantasy sense. Gateways between layers of life, between what grows on the surface and whatever sleeps deep beneath the root systems in the oldest parts of the earth. Because the redwood's roots are shallow compared to their height, but they spread wide, interlocking with other trees for miles, forming a massive living network. And inside that network, things move. The indigenous tribes of Northern California knew this long before the Park Service existed. The Yurok, Tolowa, Cholula, and Karuk all told stories of the tall watchers, beings of bark and shadow that lived within the redwoods and guarded the forest. According to the elders, these beings watched over the balance between humans and nature. They were not violent unless provoked, and the tribes warned early settlers never to cut down the oldest trees, not because of spiritual guilt, but because the guardians wake when wounded. Settlers ignored the warning. Entire groves were cut during the logging booms of the late 1800s. Massive, ancient trees fell to the ground, trees that had been alive since before Jesus, before Caesar, before the Mayan calendar. And shortly after the first groves fell, loggers began vanishing from their camps. Some were found miles away, curled into hollow trees in fetal positions as though they had crawled in seeking protection, or trying to escape something. Their eyes were always open, their bodies always intact, their faces always frozen in shock. The logging companies blamed accidents, wild animals, or drunken missteps. But the last crews to leave the region had a different explanation whispered among themselves. The forest swallowed them. As the decades passed, the sightings of figures inside the trees became rarer, but only because fewer humans were allowed near the oldest groves. The Park Service quietly expanded, restricted conservation zones, creating buffers around the largest elder trees. These buffers were not well marked. Only the rangers knew where they were and why they existed. The deeper reason for the restrictions wasn't the sightings. It was the sound. When the forest is still, and the fog is heavy, and the wind stops moving, the elder trees produce a low, groaning hum, like a distant whale song resonating through wood. The sound vibrates in the ground, in the air, even in the chest of anyone standing nearby. People describe it as a voice too deep to hear fully. Rangers learned to leave immediately when they heard it, because the hum was always followed by movement. Shifting silhouettes inside the trunks, dark shapes sliding across the wood, glowing cracks forming in the bark for only a second before sealing themselves shut. Scientists who studied the redwoods found no explanation. No animals lived inside those massive trunks. No wind tunnels or airflow could produce the hum. The trees were simply too old, too large, too complex. But the tribes had an explanation, passed down for generations. The trees remember, and what lives inside them remembers more. The Park Service had long maintained a quiet rule: never work alone inside the elder groves. Rangers paired off, even for short patrols. It wasn't because of wildlife. There were hardly any predators left in the northern forests. It wasn't because of tourists. Most avoided the darkest parts of the woods. The rule existed because something in the forest seemed to respond to solitude, something that watched more closely when a person was alone. But by the mid-2000s, the rule wasn't enough. Too many incidents were being reported, too many unexplained blackouts, too many vanished recordings, too many rangers requesting reassignment. So, in 2008, the federal government quietly launched the Elder Grove Survey, a covert investigation disguised as a conservation study. Its true purpose was to determine why cameras, GPS units, microphones, and radios died instantly within a certain distance of the oldest redwoods. The team consisted of biologists, geophysicists, electromagnetic researchers, and a handful of intelligence operatives whose presence was never explained. Their first target was a 1,000-year-old tree known as Sentinel 12. No public map listed it by name, but every ranger knew it as one of the 3 elder trees, where sightings were strongest. Sentinel 12 stood alone in a thick, fog-soaked grove, its trunk so broad that 5 grown men holding hands could barely wrap around its base. The tree's bark was darker than the others, almost black in certain light, and its crown vanished so high into the mist that no one had ever photographed the top. From the moment the survey team approached Sentinel 12, their equipment began malfunctioning. GPS units spun wildly in their hands. Heart rate monitors glitched. A drone launched above the tree's canopy lost signal midair and plunged straight down, smashing into its trunk as if pulled by a magnetic force. But the most disturbing failure came from the audio recorders. When the team replayed the sound files, all they heard was a faint, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat echoing deep inside the wood. No animal was large enough to produce that sound. No normal tree should vibrate like a living creature. Still, the team pressed forward. Their lead electromagnetic specialist, Dr. Connor Hale, approached the trunk with a palm-sized scanner. The moment he pressed it against the bark, the scanner's screen surged with readings, massive fluctuations in magnetic fields, temperature shifts, and electrical spikes. It didn't make sense. Trees aren't electromagnetic. Trees don't produce heat waves. Trees don't generate pulses. But something inside this one did. Dr. Hale backed away, shaken. "This isn't a tree," he whispered to the others. But before anyone could respond, Hale's body cam died instantly, followed by every other camera within 20 feet. Not drained, not disconnected, erased. The team tried new batteries, backup devices, thermal scanners. Everything failed the moment they pointed it toward Sentinel 12. That's when the first sound came from inside the tree, a slow scraping, like something dragging its fingers along the hollow interior. Long, deliberate, aware. Every member of the survey froze. Then a second sound, a deep, low groan, vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. Birds scattered. The fog shifted unnaturally, curling around their legs like smoke. And somewhere within the trunk, a shadow moved. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They couldn't see it directly, but the shifting of the internal darkness was unmistakable. Something was inside Sentinel 12. Something enormous. Something awake. The team panicked. 2 members ran back toward the trail. The others stepped backward, hands shaking, eyes wide. Dr. Hale remained frozen in front of the trunk. The shadow inside the tree shifted again, this time rising. The darkness lifted upward, climbing the inner walls of the trunk as if ascending through solid wood. The sound that followed was even worse. A breathing noise so deep it vibrated their bones. And then the trunk bulged outward, just slightly, like something pressed its weight from within. The team fled. That night, their footage was reviewed in an off-site facility. Every file from the grove was dead, every device corrupted. But before the cameras died, one frame survived for a fraction of a second, just a single distorted image captured during the moment the shadow rose. It showed a tall, elongated shape, 7 to 8 feet in height, limbs long and curved, body narrow but powerful, pressed against the inside of the trunk. Its outline was humanoid, but nothing about it was human. Its fingers were too long, its shoulders too broad, its silhouette too fluid, as if made of smoke trapped inside wood. The analysts couldn't determine if the being was made of shadow, bark, or something in between. They named it the Redwood Guardian. The next phase of the investigation began immediately, scanning the forest floor around the elder trees. The team expected normal root systems. Instead, they discovered something far more extraordinary. The roots of Sentinel 12 weren't just connected to the trees around it. They were connected to every major redwood in the grove, forming a massive underground network stretching nearly 2 miles. A root system, too vast, too perfectly structured, too interconnected to be natural. The researchers concluded that the elder trees were not individual organisms. They were a single entity, a single mind, a single being with different bodies above ground. And something was moving within that network. When they scanned deeper beneath Sentinel 12, the readings turned impossible. Something massive, larger than any tree root, larger than any animal, was pulsing slowly. A shape, a chamber, a cavity. And inside the cavity, the scanner detected heat. Heat that rose, fell, rose again, like a sleeping organism breathing. The rangers knew the stories. The tribes knew the warnings. But the government now had the first scientific proof. The Redwood Guardians were real. And they were not spirits. They were biological, alive, and waking. The underground scans beneath Sentinel-12 changed everything. What began as a conservation study had quietly transformed into the most unsettling biological discovery on U.S. soil. The deeper the sensors probed, the more impossible the readings became. Beneath the roots, far below the thin, wide web that redwoods were known for, lay a large, warm chamber buried directly under the elder grove. It wasn't a cavern formed by water or erosion. Its walls were too smooth, its shape too symmetrical. It was a perfect oval, like an egg, resting silently beneath centuries of soil. And inside that oval chamber, something pulsed. At first, the scientists thought the pulse was a glitch, maybe interference from the roots or electromagnetic anomalies. But after 72 hours of continuous readings, the truth became undeniable. The pulse was steady, rhythmic, biological. Something beneath the forest was alive, and more disturbingly, it was in sync with the vibrations inside Sentinel-12. The government shut down public access to the grove under the excuse of storm damage. Rangers were replaced by armed personnel wearing unmarked uniforms. The Elder Grove Survey went underground, literally and politically. But the indigenous tribes living nearby already knew what the scientists were beginning to learn. When the researchers requested tribal access to specific lands for deeper scans, the tribal council refused instantly. They didn't want more evidence. They didn't want more data. They wanted the scientists to leave. One of the Yurok elders, an old man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, issued a warning during a private meeting. The forest has guardians. They sleep in the trees. They walk when the balance breaks. Leave them. But humans didn't leave. The Elder Grove Survey's next step was the most risky one yet. A nighttime observation mission. Cameras failed in daylight, so the team reasoned that maybe thermal imaging at night would behave differently. They were wrong. But what happened next became the most infamous night in Redwood Ranger history. The team arrived at the grove just after midnight. Fog hung so thick it looked like pale smoke. The forest was silent. Too silent. Not a single insect buzzed. Not a single owl called. Even the wind died the moment the team stepped into the Elder Grove perimeter. They set up equipment at the base of Sentinel-12, thermal scanners, motion sensors, an array of specialized microphones. One by one, the devices began to malfunction. First the microphones, then the thermal screens, then the motion detectors. Everything died in the same 20-foot radius around Sentinel-12. But before the last camera failed, it recorded something horrifying. A hand. Long, bark-textured, and impossibly tall, pressing outward from inside the tree. Not breaking through the bark, pressing through it like pushing through thick fabric. The fingers were slender and too long, bending slightly at joints that were not human. The texture looked like wet bark mixed with dark bone. The hand withdrew instantly when light struck it, but its outline burned into the minds of everyone who saw the footage before it corrupted. Something was trying to step out of the tree. Just moments later, the ground beneath the grove vibrated. A low, rolling rumble, like thunder muffled under miles of soil. The pulse from the chamber beneath the forest grew stronger, faster, louder. The scientists panicked. They began packing equipment, shouting orders, trying to retreat. But the forest wouldn't let them. The temperature dropped so quickly, their breath fogged. A wind rose from nowhere, cold, sharp, and carrying the scent of soil and wood and something older, something metallic. The fog thickened around Sentinel-12, swirling like a vortex at the base of the trunk. And then the groaning began, deep, massive, resonating through every tree in the grove. The sound came from the trunks themselves. as if the trees were speaking in a frequency too old for modern ears. A ranger, one of the few remaining locals, fell to his knees, covering his ears. "They're waking," he whispered. "We shouldn't be here. They warned us. They warned us." Then it happened. The first Redwood Guardian stepped out. Not fully, not completely, but enough. A silhouette emerged from the fog, 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, limbs shaped like twisted branches, a torso that rippled like bark and smoke merging together, a head with no face, just 2 deep grooves where eyes should be. Its entire body looked carved from living wood, but moved like a muscular creature forged from shadow and root. It stepped forward, not walking on the ground but hovering inches above it, drifting like a weightless being. Lights died instantly. Radios screamed with static. One scientist fainted. Another dropped his equipment and ran. The Guardian turned its head toward the fleeing man. The fog around it darkened. The trees groaned again, this time louder and more urgent. And then, with a speed impossible for something so large, the Guardian moved. Not forward, not backward, but through a tree, slipping into the bark as though its body dissolved into wood. The forest grew silent again. The fog settled. The ground stopped trembling. But the damage was done. The team fled the grove in terror, some vomiting, some crying, some refusing to speak for days. They returned to the facility with only fragments of footage, most of it corrupted, all of it unusable for public release. But one thermal image survived. Just one. A silhouette, emerging from the trunk of Sentinel 12. Tall, humanoid, ancient, watching. The tribes called them guardians. The rangers called them shadows. The government called them entities. But the scientists had a different name after that night. The Woodwalkers. The night the Woodwalker emerged from Sentinel 12, something changed permanently in the Redwood ecosystem. The forest did not simply return to silence. It shifted into a different kind of awareness, as though the entire grove had awakened from a centuries-long sleep. Within hours of the encounter, every tree in the elder grove displayed erratic, electromagnetic fluctuations. Ranger radios crackled uncontrollably. Wildlife fled in waves. Even the fog behaved strangely. It rose in long, spiraling columns instead of drifting naturally. And deep below the soil, the chamber that once pulsed with slow, rhythmic life now thrummed with a violent, escalating energy. The scientists monitoring the underground readings stared in disbelief. The pulse doubled, then tripled, then stabilized into a steady, powerful frequency that rattled lab equipment miles away from the grove. The chamber beneath the forest was no longer dormant. It was opening. But before the team could analyze the new data, something more immediate and far more terrifying began happening at ground level. For decades, everyone believed there were 1 or 2 guardians, maybe 3, entities that moved within the ancient trunks, like spirits trapped inside wood. But after the first Woodwalker revealed itself, more shadows began to appear. In the nights that followed, cameras positioned at the forest perimeter captured fleeting silhouettes between the fog. Not inside the trees, between them. Tall shapes drifting from trunk to trunk, as if the beings within the redwoods were no longer confined to their wooden hosts. And then, during a late-night patrol, a ranger witnessed something that confirmed the scientist's worst fear. He saw 2 woodwalkers, not one, not a trick of the fog, not a reflection. 2 towering entities standing side by side at the base of an elder tree, their bark-like limbs rising out of the earth as if grown from the roots themselves. They were shaped like humanoid giants carved from ancient wood, glowing faintly with bioluminescent veins beneath their surface. Their bodies pulsed with a rhythm that matched the deep underground chamber exactly. Then, just as silently as they appeared, both beings dissolved into the bark, slipping inside the trunk like liquid shadows returning home. The ranger reported the sighting, and was immediately removed from duty. The Elder Grove Survey now knew the truth. There were not a few guardians. There were many, and they were stirring. The underground chamber opens. While the forest above grew restless, the underground sensors detected a seismic shift. The chamber beneath Sentinel 12, once sealed for millennia, was beginning to crack. The walls of the chamber were softening, as if heat or biological activity was dissolving the hardened layers of stone and root. Thermal imaging revealed something more horrifying. Inside the chamber was movement. Slow, massive, rhythmic. The movement was not random. It mirrored the pattern of the Guardians emerging above ground. Whatever lived below was connected to the beings in the trees. Perhaps it controlled them. Perhaps it created them. Or perhaps the Guardians were trying to protect it. The scientists desperately tried to descend into the underground tunnel network to reach the chamber. But every attempt failed. Tools malfunctioned. Lights died instantly. And once, a worker trying to enter the tunnel felt something grip his ankle. Something cold, bark-textured, and impossibly strong. He escaped with deep bruises that formed perfect finger-shaped marks. The team now understood why the tribes had forbidden entry for centuries. The night the forest moved. The most terrifying event in Redwood history occurred on August 11, 2012. What began as a quiet, fog-heavy night turned into a phenomenon so impossible that even the U.S. Geological Survey was forced to open an investigation. At 2:14 a.m., with no wind and no seismic activity, dozens of the tallest redwoods began to tilt. Not falling, not swaying from wind, leaning in the same direction, as if bowing toward something, or listening. Every elder tree in the grove shifted at the same impossible angle, 3 degrees to the east, and held their position for several minutes. Bark cracked, leaves trembled. The ground pulsed like a heartbeat through the soil. Then, the groaning began again, deep, heavy, ancient. The same sound the trees made the night the Guardian stepped out. But this time, the groan wasn't coming from just Sentinel 12. It came from every elder tree at once. The scientists monitoring audio feeds described it as a choir of giants speaking in slow, painful breaths. The sound was so intense that microphones ruptured. Soil vibrated. Birds crashed into the ground mid-flight, as if stunned by an unseen force. And then, the impossible happened. The entire grove shifted position, 3 feet. To the east, trees taller than skyscrapers, older than empires, each weighing hundreds of tons, all moving in perfect unison, without falling, without breaking. It was not a landslide. It was not an earthquake. It was the forest itself moving, as if pulled by something underground. And right after the grove shifted, the underground chamber fully opened. The sensors went wild. The temperature spiked to levels found in volcanic vents. Pressure readings broke equipment. A new frequency appeared. Not a pulse, not a heartbeat, but a call. High, melodic, resonant, stretching miles through soil and root. This was not the sound of waking. It was the sound of summoning. Summoning what? The Guardians reacted instantly. Shadows spilled out from the bark of the elder trees. Dozens of tall, humanoid shapes emerging like soldiers summoned from a fortress. Their glowing patterns pulsed in perfect synchronization with the new frequency. The rangers watching from the perimeter fell to the ground, overwhelmed by dizziness, nausea, and ringing in their ears. The Guardians gathered around the grove in a massive formation, facing inward, as if preparing for something colossal, something rising from below. Then, for the first time, the underground chamber was visible from the surface, not physically, but as a glowing red heat pattern that spread through the soil like molten light. The moment lasted only minutes, but the meaning was clear. Something ancient was waking beneath America's oldest trees. And the Guardians were not the danger. They were the protectors. When the elder grove shifted 3 feet to the east, every scientist, ranger, and underground sensor operator realized the truth at the exact same moment. The redwoods weren't reacting to the chamber beneath them. They were protecting it. They weren't trees leaning. They were giants bracing. They were guardians preparing for something to rise. The underground chamber, now fully awakened, pulsed with waves of heat so intense that thermal maps glowed bright red, bleeding upward like volcanic blood. But this wasn't magma. This wasn't tectonic. This wasn't geological. This was biological. The chamber below the redwood roots wasn't just an egg. It wasn't a nest. It wasn't a cavern. It was a cradle. A cradle older than the continent. Older than the trees. Possibly older than humanity. And whatever had slept inside it for millennia was no longer sleeping. For hours, the chamber emitted low-frequency calls. Long, echoing melodies that resonated through every trunk, every root, every leaf. The Redwood Guardians gathered around the grove in massive numbers, their bark-skinned forms emerging fully from the trees for the first time in human history. Dozens, then hundreds. Silhouettes stepping out of trunks, like soldiers marching from portals. Their bodies pulsed with glowing cracks, veins of bioluminescence that flickered in perfect rhythm with the subterranean chamber. The forest was not just moving, it was preparing. The tribes had warned this would happen. The old stories said, "When the earth cries, the guardians rise, not to fight for humans, not to fight against humans, but to hold back what sleeps below." The scientists didn't understand. The government didn't understand. But the Guardians understood exactly what was coming. At 3:58 a.m., everything changed. The chamber beneath the forest burst, not with an explosion, but with a single, violent exhale. A blast of hot air erupted through the soil, cracking the ground around Sentinel 12. Roots tore upward. Stones rolled aside. Fog shredded into swirling spirals. The air became electrified, humming with static that made hair rise and skin prickle. And then the sound came. A roar. So deep, so ancient, so powerful it almost stopped the hearts of everyone within miles. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It wasn't the sound of a creature. It was the sound of something enormous moving for the first time in thousands of years. The Guardians fell into formation, surrounding the heart of the grove. Their limbs extended. Their bodies grew rigid. Their glowing veins brightened, blinding white, like molten lightning trapped inside tree bark. The ground split open. A massive fissure tore through Sentinel 12's base. Roots flailed upward like dying serpents. The soil collapsed into a deep shaft. And then, deep in the darkness, something massive shifted. It wasn't a limb. It wasn't a body. It was bigger, far bigger. A shape the size of a building, curved, layered, breathing. Every guardian stepped backward at the same time, lowering their heads in something that looked like reverence or fear. The being inside the chamber was stirring. The first thing the scientists saw wasn't a creature. It was light. A crimson glow, like the dying embers of a star, radiated upward from the fissure. The glow pulsed, forming rings in the air, rings that matched the hums the forest had broadcast for centuries. And then the shape emerged. Slowly, heavily, unimaginably massive. A colossal, root-covered form pressed against the opening, like a titan struggling to rise after ages of sleep. Its skin wasn't flesh. It was wood. Ancient wood. Fossilized and hardened, cracked and layered, like the trunk of a tree forged into the shape of a being. A head slowly lifted into view, its form humanoid, but carved from millennia of mineral, soil, and living bark. Two hollow, cavernous eyes glowed with red embers deep inside, like coals smoldering in sockets that had once seen epochs. The Redwood Guardians bowed. The scientists watching from the perimeter collapsed to their knees in terror. The tribes later called this being by its ancient name, the Root Father. According to Yurok mythology, the Root Father was the first guardian, an ancient protector, birthed in a time before humans, before animals, before even forests existed. Its purpose was simple and terrifying: to rise only when the balance of the land was broken beyond repair. The Root Father stepped forward, earth trembling under its massive weight. But it did not attack. It did not roar again. It simply looked upward through the trees, as if inspecting the world it had not seen in ages. The Guardians surrounded it, protecting it from all sides. Then, the moment came that none of the scientists could comprehend. The Root Father spoke. The sound wasn't human language. It was a deep, groaning vibrational series of tones, the same tones the elder trees had echoed for decades. The Guardians responded in harmonic waves, creating a chorus that shook the soil. The conversation lasted less than a minute, and when it ended, the Root Father lowered itself back into the chamber. Roots twisted around it. Soil closed. Light faded. It went back to sleep. The Guardians stepped backward, dissolving into the trunks one by one. The fissure sealed. The grove straightened. The forest exhaled. And then, complete stillness, as if nothing had happened at all. By sunrise, the elder grove looked untouched. But everyone who had witnessed the event knew the truth. The forest had awakened only to prevent something worse. The government sealed the area permanently. Satellite access was blocked. Public maps were altered. All recorded data was confiscated. Every witness signed permanent silence agreements. But one scientist, before disappearing from public life, wrote a final note in his field journal. The Guardians did not rise to protect humans. They rose to protect the Earth from us. And that is why the Redwoods remain standing. Why cameras fail. Why shadows move inside the trunks. Why the forest hums. Why the Guardians sleep. Because beneath the oldest trees in America, something ancient and powerful slumbers. And the Guardians will rise again, only if the Earth calls them.